So, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning to those of you who have mornings. One of our speakers, Kerilyn, is actually at the moment in Georgia, in USA, so it's early morning for her, and I believe for many others, it's also different time zones, and so it's all great that that you managed to join us for the seminar on pandemia and forced immobility. So this is this month's Multicultures and Migration Observatory seminar, as due to obviously all the lockdowns is not possible in the real world, but quite successfully, I might say, we have switched into virtual reality, and as a result, many more people could join our seminars, and it's devoted to the theme of coronavirus pandemia and forced immobility. And it will answer some of the questions such as what are the key findings from the research of the speakers into mobility important for the current situation of forced immobility. What is the impact of pandemia on migrants in major emigration, transit, and immigration countries? And thirdly, what could be the short and long-term impact of pandemia on local and global migration processes? Pandemia, quite interestingly, has immobilized not only the most mobile, but also those immobile. It has forced us all to remain immobile. And those for whom this forced immobility is particularly painful are migrants. Interestingly, yet a month ago, those who were most mobile were viewed with envy and jealousy by those who were less mobile. Today, migrants are viewed with suspicion, and they are feared as prospective pandemia spreaders. Recently, an information emerged that members of the Tablighi Jama movement, which is a Muslim missionary movement, are viewed as super spreaders due to a huge convention which they held in South Pakistan and then moved to all countries around the world. And some of these questions around the impact of pandemia on migration processes will be tackled by fantastic speakers that we've invited to our seminar today. And in the order how they will be speaking, first will be Caroline Schewel, who is a research fellow in the International Migration Institute at the University of Amsterdam. Then I'll pass the mic to Biao Xiang, who is a professor of social anthropology and researcher in the Center on Migration, Policy and Society at the University of Oxford. Then the floor will be passed to Olena Babakova, who is historian and journalist, a Krytyka Polityczna, whose research interests focus on Ukrainian migration to the EU, Poland's migration policy and integration policies in the EU. And lastly, Stephen Vertovec, that probably doesn't need to be introduced. He's director of Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. And before I give mic to Kerilyn, just for all the participants, and at the moment I see there are above 60 persons that joined us today, I just want to tell you that each of the speakers will be talking for approximately 15 minutes. And then we will pass to Q&A. As you hear the presentations of each of the speakers, you may ask questions in the chat. And then I will be selecting these questions and asking these questions during Q&A. Or if technology will allow us this, we'll also try to give you the possibility to ask the questions to our distinguished panelists personally. Without further overdue, I would like to give now the possibility to floor to Kerilyn.
Thanks so much, Konrad, and very happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion. I was asked to share a bit about my own research interests and what potential insights they can shed on this particular crazy moment in time in which we're all living under a global pandemic. So my research examines the relationship between aspirations and capabilities to migrate, and the consequences for individuals and societies when these do or do not match. Much of my research is situated in Ethiopia, which you could say is a society where aspirations to migrate are rising faster than opportunities to do so. And this gives rise to what Jorgen Carling originally referred to as involuntary immobility. So to date, my research has really emphasized the ways in which mobility is often a privilege, that the most disadvantaged are those who aspire to migrate but lack the capability to do so, whether because they don't have enough financial, human, or social resources to move, or because of border controls or other constraints that hinder movement. But this pandemic has, for me, really highlighted the other side of the coin, particularly the ways in which immobility can be a privilege. In our current reality, this is often reserved for those who can afford to shelter in place, who have the luxury of working from home. Those who are still mobile during these times are often our fundamental workers, those who do the low-paid work without which society could not function. And so I thought maybe the main point I'll try to make in these few short remarks is that there are many different ways of being immobile, and that a focus on the cause and consequences of immobility, particularly in the unique context of a global pandemic, has an important contribution to make to migration studies more generally. In the early 1990s, the geographer Doreen Massey argued that, she said, mobility and control over mobility both reflects and reinforces power. It is not simply a question of unequal distribution, that some people move more than others and that some have more control than others. It is that the mobility and control of some groups can actively weaken other people. I think what we're seeing right now is that immobility and the control over immobility also reflects and reinforces power. There are those for whom their experience of immobility is within their control. And perhaps this is the case for many of us here, those who can continue working from home, those who maybe chose where they wanted to shelter in place and drove to a family or friend's house before the lockdowns began, those who are inconvenienced, to say the least, by lockdown orders, but whose livelihoods and well-being are not fundamentally at stake. We can say that these people have greater control over their immobility. But then there are those for whom a lockdown is, at the very extreme, a death warrant. There are reports from all over the world of those who live day to day or hand to mouth, who fear a shelter-in-place order means the threat of starvation. From street vendors and migrant workers in India to waste pickers or reclaimers in South Africa. One academic, Melanie Sampson, reported, reclaimers in Johannesburg are faced with a deadly choice: stay at home and watch their children starve, or keep salvaging and risk contracting the virus. When they go out to work, they're also in danger of being beaten and arrested by police and security, but they don't have any other options. Yet, even when immobility does not threaten death, immobility can mean losing one's job, one's business. As a result, it can mean losing one's home, one's ability to pay for a child's education. In these cases, people do not have control over their immobility. We might see these people as displaced in place, which is a phrase once used by Stephen Lukeman to describe involuntary immobility in the context of conflict. To be displaced in place is a vastly different kind of immobility than the immobility of the privileged. And then, of course, there are those who are still working and moving, even under the dangerous conditions associated with the pandemic, what we might call the forced mobility of essential workers, often the low-paid care workers, farm workers, truck drivers, cashiers, and many others who place themselves at greater risk, often because they're living paycheck to paycheck and cannot afford to be immobile. Their work is essential to maintain the basic functioning of society, but as one essential worker in the US put it, "I don't feel essential, I feel exhausted and expendable." Many of these essential workers are also migrant workers. In the US, immigrant field workers, many of whom are undocumented, have been told to keep working despite stay-at-home directives. They've been given letters from their employers attesting to their critical role in feeding the nation and assured that certain, measures from immigration enforcement will be lightened at this period in time. In Qatar, you see migrant workers from Southeast Asia who are continuing to work to build the stadiums, to advance the infrastructure projects for the World Cup that will be hosted there in 2022. These migrant workers remain mobile and thus more vulnerable to contracting the virus, but most importantly, they lack the same protections as citizens of the states in which they are working. So these examples, what I want to highlight through them is that immobility is not one thing. Even under a common mandate of forced immobility, under a lockdown, there are many different ways of staying in place. And to understand these differentiated forms of immobility, we have to understand the socioeconomic context of individuals and communities. So in this light, we often hear that this virus does not discriminate. It affects the poor and the powerful alike. But does it? Because certain segments of society are certainly at greater risk than others. If we think about the threat of this virus in the context of a refugee camp, in a prison, in crowded urban slums, in places where people do not have control over their immobility. We can also consider the alarming mortality rates among African Americans in the US. These numbers are just starting to come out. In Louisiana, 32% of the population is African American, but 70% of deaths from the coronavirus are Black individuals. In Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, African Americans make up only 26% of the population, but 73% of deaths. And one explanation for this disturbing disparity has to do with higher levels of comorbidity, higher rates of hypertension or diabetes or heart disease. But another explanation might also be that African Americans are disproportionately represented in work that requires people to stay mobile, as bus drivers or care workers, for example. And social scientists, I'm sure, will dig into the underlying reasons for these disparities, but they highlight that any analysis of the impacts of this pandemic on mobility or any other social process will have to be done in light of entrenched inequalities based on race, ethnicity, class, or indeed migration status. So stepping out of the immediate impacts of the pandemic, I wanted to close by sharing just a few short reflections which come from an article that I published last year in International Migration Review, in which I argue that a focus on immobility has an important contribution to make to migration studies. In that paper, I argue that migration studies suffers from a mobility bias, that migration research overwhelmingly focuses on understanding the causes and consequences of migration and mobility for individuals, communities, and societies. But the reasons why people do not move or do not want to move and the consequences of widespread immobility remain largely under-theorized and understudied. And in a world characterized by such wide inequalities in wealth and security and material well-being worldwide, an important question is why so few people migrate. As many of us are probably aware, international migrants have long composed only 2 to 4% of the world's population. And if one factors in internal migration, about which we only have very rough statistics, but we can generally say about 1 in 7 people on the planet are on the move, and yet few scholars are asking why 6 out of 7 people are not. And I think this mobility bias has consequences at the level of migration theory. It leads scholars to focus on migration's drivers and to overlook the countervailing forces that restrict or resist these drivers. And as a result, our theoretical frameworks and much of our empirical research often fail to explain why the size of migration flows is actually much smaller than our theories would lead us to predict. For me, in thinking about how to advance a research agenda on immobility, I find it helpful to make a distinction between the aspiration and the capability to migrate or to stay. So in the crudest terms, this distinction can help us see when immobility is a result of the aspiration to stay. People do not wish to migrate, they're thus voluntarily immobile. And when it is the result of structural constraints, people aspire to migrate but lack the capability to do so, the involuntarily immobile, as Jorgen Carling put it. And there's often, this is obviously a spectrum with a lot of in between, but these are sort of ideal types that can help us make sense of these different forms of immobility that we encounter. And I think this distinction between aspiration and capability can help us ask some interesting questions about the effects of this pandemic on immobility processes. For example, when is immobility desired? When is it forced? Much academic research focuses on the capability to migrate, but what about the capability to stay? When can we say people have the capability to stay, and when do they lack it? Which makes me think of the displaced in place. What are the consequences of immobility for the displaced in place? Can we say that these people lack the capability to stay even if they are immobile? So hopefully this pandemic will provide an opportunity to give greater attention and focus to the causes and consequences of immobility in migration studies. And I think I'll leave it there and pass it off to our next speaker so we can continue this discussion.
Thank you very much, Kerilyn. In the meantime, in the chat, I've shared the link to your article that you referred to, and it's freely accessible, so anybody can have access to it. So now I'd like to give a floor or mic to Biao Xiang. And yeah, one of the major reasons also that led me to Biao was an excellent pandemia forum that he's managing at the Compass University of Oxford. So Biao, now the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I would like to share a few thoughts, which are very preliminary thought at this stage. I'm thinking, the forced immobility in the context of pandemic probably should be more accurately thought as a redistribution of mobilities. And I identified 6 types of mobilities that just emerged, which have not been properly understood in migration studies. Yet all these 6 types of mobilities are very consequential for pandemic control as well as for people's life.
Sorry.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah, so the first type of migration or mobility is what I call the reaction mobility. Reaction mobility basically means the people flee from the epicenter, especially in the anticipation that there is imminent lockdown. In Wuhan, within the first 10 hours, when it was announced that the Wuhan city, the original epicenter in China, was going to be locked down, about 300,000 people left immediately. And also we know in Italy, something happened. And this kind of flight, in a way, out of panic. So how did it start? Who are the most likely person to join this type of mobility? And what is the temporal dynamics, right? It started at a certain point, but it may pick up and may go down. As far as I know, it is very little known, but I think it's very important for policymakers to understand the dynamics of this kind of reaction mobility. And now we know there's lots of similar reaction mobilities taking place among groups like students, large number of Asian students now try to get back from Europe and the US to their Asian countries, which they regard as safer, and also travelers, tourists, they all want to rush home. That is the first mobility, the reaction mobility. Second type is I call the survival mobility. Survival mobility, the typical example is all these millions migrants from India who want to go home desperately, and often take up to 10 days. So I think the news report often indicated that it's quite common for them to, for family, 5 or 6 walk 5 or 6 days from Delhi to UP and on foot because of the halt of public transport. And these people remind me what I worked on before in 2003 among the Chinese migrant workers in the context of SARS outbreak in 2003. And at that time, in April and May, about 2 months, 400,000 Chinese migrant workers left the cities and went back home to their countryside. And I interviewed some of them, it's a bit, you went home. Of course, that was very alarming for policymakers because they think that will spread the virus back to the countryside, where it is where the health facilities is much weaker. And I asked them, were you afraid of the virus? Therefore, you fled? And the answer is no. And the migrant workers, of course, they knew there is a virus. They are concerned about it. But the main reason for them to leave the cities and going back to the countryside is not because of health concern. Their primary concern is money, is a wage, food. And this is what happened among the Indian migrants now. I couldn't do any primary research, but by reading newspapers, that is a very clear picture. They had to go home because there's simply no money to buy food for that day. So that is not a necessary, so it's different from the reaction mobility. Reaction mobility was more driven by kind of panic, fear of the health itself. Actually, these are more for people of the middle class status, typically for the people who have second home in the countryside and etc. But the survival mobility are for people of lower social status, and they have to move not because of virus itself, but because of how the government and how the mainstream society responded to the outbreak, right? You have a sudden lockdown announced by the federal government of India, or in 2003, there's a sudden shift in the government policy in China. So there's a large sectors, a large number of like construction sites and restaurants were shut down. So migrants lost their job as well as lost their accommodation. So they had to go in order to survive. I mean, there's some minor sub categories under survival mobility, like hospital runs in China and the shelter runs in India. And we can discuss that later if we have time. The third type of mobility that emerged during the lockdown is what I call the substitution mobility. Substitution mobility is that, okay, if you ask many people don't move and stay home, someone else have to move on your behalf in order to carry for your survival. I mean, of course, we know the typical example is a food delivery workers whose number actually increased dramatically over last 1 or 2 months. I mean, in China, one company recruited within less than 2 months, they recruited more than 400,000 delivery workers just to deliver food. And this substitution mobility can be divided in two categories. One is organized by government. The second one is organized through the commercial companies, like delivery companies. And then this substitution mobility, the mobility who substitute other people's mobility is obviously not something spontaneously happened. It must be organized either by government or by commercial entities. So there's a lot of research to be done in order to dig out how this type of mobility is organized, and then how they are rewarded, and how the workers are protected in these special circumstances. The fourth type of mobility is Limbal Mobility. Then we observed a sizable number of people were thrown into limbos during the lockdown. A quick example is that if a driver who is driving a truck, or just the ordinary person driving his her private car on the road, on the highway, at the moment when lockdown was announced. And that person cannot go home because the province was, I mean, this is a scenario in China where lockdown is very strictly implemented. And he or she is not allowed to enter the province, which now is sealed. And because he and or she is coming from this epicenter according to the ID card and according to the license of the car, so nowhere else dare to take that person in. So the person cannot check in to a hotel or motel. And then we have a few quite people like that who live on the highway, just drive from one place to another for nearly 1 month. And also during this lockdown, for the first time in China, for over last, I think 30 or 40 years, we have a group of homeless people in cities like Wuhan. Who are they? They are migrant workers who lost the job, lost the accommodation, but yet they are not allowed to go home because the whole city locked down. So they had to live on the street, which is completely new for most of Chinese population. So now there's some emergency food delivery service being very quickly invented to cater for their needs. I mean, these people have also to move around in the city in order looking for food and for places to sleep. So that's Limbal Mobility. Small number, but the human consequences are obviously very significant. And I suppose now is the fourth type is what I call exception mobility. I mean, all these words sound a bit of odd, not very elegant. So I really want your suggestion as well, how to make it more accurate and catcher. Exception mobility means mobilities that are exception to travel bans. We know most of I'm not sure it's most, not certainly majority country in the world now have implemented a certain kind of travel ban, one type or another. But every travel ban comes with certain exceptions. And roughly there's two types of exception. One is officially declared exceptions, primarily catering for the person who are citizens returning from overseas back home, then you have to take them in. Or there is exception mobilities, actually the secret clandestine smuggling type of mobility taking place to circumvent the travel ban. Both exist. And then we needed to, so we really needed to assess the effectiveness of a travel ban if you have all these multiple exceptional channels open, right? So that is the fifth type of mobility, kind of unintended, that emerged during lockdown. Finally, we should pay attention to the mobility of things, which I personally didn't pay much attention before, but this time I really see how important it is to logistically organize a movement of goods. First of all, you have the facial masks and medical equipment. How can you deliver them timely to epicenters? And then, as shown in the Indian case, the food delivery became very important during this crisis. How can you deliver food to the person needed in a timely manner without creating unintended crowding and long queuing? Because one thing that we saw in Delhi in last month is that they create a shelter and they create a food ration sections in schools. Then your large number of migrants flocked into these particular sites to get the food or to sleep. Then they create large gatherings, which is exactly what you don't want during the pandemic. So that the movement of things, how much movement of things with mobility or immobility of people, the people as a recipient of the goods, as well as the people who will deliver these goods, right? There's a kind of the matrix of mobility of people, of different type of people and different type of goods. So the final thought is that probably we should think mobilities as a kind of assemblage. Society in both the ordinary normal circumstances, as well as in these very exceptional circumstances, mobilities are always, we know, of multiple types and meaning different things for different people. But the most important thing is how the different type of mobilities mix together and match or mismatch together. So that is assemblage, right? Whether or not they can match, that is the most important thing, rather than you have more or less mobility, right? So that is a question of composition rather just the volume or quantity. So that I suppose is, I mean, for me, maybe it has been discussed many times before in literature, but for me that is something quite new. And so also this sixth type of mobilities is something that I really wanted to learn more about. So this is the first time that I try to describe these six types. So I really want to hear from you what you think of them, and if you can tell me more examples, observations that about the six types, that would be great, as well as how we can make them conceptually sharper and accurate. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Biao. One of the reasons why I also wanted, obviously, Biao to be part of this seminar is to reflect on the Chinese experience. So the Chinese is, at least, especially the city of Wuhan, that was the first the epicenter and the first place to be forcibly made immobile. And the good news is that some of you may have heard is that actually yesterday the city of Wuhan was for the first time partially open, and we could see people crying to be able to board a train and to be able to go out, because obviously the forced immobility looks differently in different parts of the world. This is also, I think, important dimension that in some places, such as the place where we will pass now, Central and Eastern Europe, and more generally Europe, there is a strong advice to stay immobile. And obviously those, as Carling nicely put it, who are privileged, especially, they can easily, especially if they have good housing conditions, they can easily stay in. While those, but in many places, obviously people are not only advised, but they are forced, really literally forced to stay locked. I think one of the best image of this forced lockdown is the situation of those who are on cruise ships. We have actually one of our students I just learned in the morning that she's locked down in one of the cruise ships in Australia. So this is this interesting situation when those who are mobile and at the same time are in faraway places locked down, and they are virtually like in prisons. They cannot leave the cruise ship until it gets cleared and people are quarantined. So now, as I mentioned, we will move to Central and Eastern Europe, and I'll give floor to Olena Babakova.
Hi, hello, good morning, good afternoon, Konrad. Many thanks for invitation to be a speaker at this seminar among these distinguished guests. In comparison to previous speakers, I'm not a member of academic community, I'm a journalist, but during the last, it seems to me, 7 years, I deeply researched the topic of Ukrainian migration to Poland. So the presentation I would like to share today, please give me 1 second, I will share my screen, everybody, to see it. Does it work? Okay. So I would like to share my mostly observations about how the latest lockdown affect the Ukrainian migrants community in Poland. Probably if you're interested in migration studies, you know that Poland became famous during the last years as an EU member state, which issued the record number of short-term living permits. Most of the people who obtain this living permits are the citizens of Ukraine. So the biggest part of my presentation will be devoted especially to their living and working conditions today after the lockdown and after the border closing made by Polish and Ukrainian government in the mid-March. So just a brief introduction, key facts about migrants in Poland. If in 90s and beginning of the century, Poland struggled with high unemployment rate, high emigration rate, so immigration wasn't even a topic at Polish society. After 2006-2007, the situation started to change. So firstly, in 2007, Polish government created so-called Declaration of Foreign Employment. It is a very liberal instrument which lets Polish business to employ the citizens of 6 particular countries, 5 Eastern Partnership countries plus Russia, among them Ukraine, which really revolutionized the Polish labor market. In 2012, we had the new Citizenship Law. Poland is one of the few EU states which doesn't want migrants from Eastern Europe who want to obtain citizenship to resign from their first citizenship. You could have both Polish and Russian, for example, or Polish and Ukrainian passport at once. 2013 new foreigners law, which a new more liberal procedure of obtaining of short-term living permit. But during the last years, on the one hand, we have quite liberal in the terms of the situation in the whole European Union migration law, but we have no formal migration policy concept. The new law in Justin government created in 2015 and 2016 denounced the previous one, migration policy concept, until this day, so I mean the beginning of 2020, there is no official document which regulates how many migrants do need Poland, which way it wants to see the legalization procedure, how it sees the role of migrants in the labor market, and maybe the most essential aspect, how Polish government sees the integration processes. In terms of numbers, if we're talking about migrants community in Poland today, it is more than 400,000 holders of living permits, including also EU citizens, and more than 1 million of holders of declarations, so the sort of documents which lead for the short-term employment. So the clear domination of short-term, seasonal and circular migrants. If we want to track the trends, so 127,000 applications for short-term living permits in 2016 and mostly twice in 2019. If we're talking about the forms of participation in labor market, maybe one of the numbers we do knew precisely is the number of migrants who are paying social security tax. It's 600,000. It doesn't mean automatically that the rest of the migrants are employed illegally. They could be employed with the contracts with only income tax without social tax. But here is the number of so-called permanent participants of labor market. As I said, the history of immigration to Poland during the latest years, it is a history mostly about Ukrainian immigration. Ukrainians hold more than 70% of all short-time living permits and more than 85% of these so-called declarations of employment. The other groups, as you see on this slide, the statistics, Georgian, approximately 5%, Indians, this community is growing during the last 3 years. It's a little bit more than 3%, and the other communities, it's a really relatively small number. So, as I mentioned, if we're talking about migrants community in Poland, we are talking about mostly Ukrainian migrants community in Poland. This community today could be estimated approximately for 1 million persons. Polish National Bank last year made a report, and it estimated the Ukrainian workers on Polish labor market for 900,000. The telemetry research made at the beginning of the previous year showed more than 1 million of mobile phone users who use Ukrainian language in their devices and Russian language and could be identified as Ukrainian migrants. Plus one criteria, there are people who crossed the Polish-Ukrainian border at least once during the last year. 1/5 to 1/4 of these migrants could be identified as middle and long-term migrants. The rest one is a population of circular short-term migrants. Most of them come to the country for 3 to 6 months. During the last 3 years, we have more male than female. Around half of the Ukrainian migrants are younger than 35. And during the last 2 years, we observed a growing number of migrants from central Ukraine. Previously, the largest community were inhabitants of Western Ukraine, and the growing numbers of migrants from rural, not city areas. Depends on the poll, 1/6 to 1/3 of them declare they wish to stay longer in Poland, whatever it means. But as we see, the numbers of people who applied for living permits are growing, but they're still not so high. And maybe the last trend I want really to stress, it's the low level of integration. Polish politicians like to say about Ukrainian migration is preferable one because of cultural and geographical closeness. But as the latest research prove, Ukrainian migrants, even those who live in the country for 5 or 10 years, still have really low number of polls of Polish citizens among their social networks. I mean, real social networks, not Facebook. And the polls made last year actually show that more than half of Ukrainian migrants declare they know Polish language poor or really very poor. So it means that these people are around. These people often work in services, in rural area, in production. But the fact that they do not provoke any social tension doesn't mean automatically that they are well integrated. Just short to mention that Ukrainians in Poland, they have 3 types of how they're entitled to stay. It's using visa-free regime. Poland is one of the few countries in the EU which lets the migrants who use the visa-free scheme to work legally. It's also visa, Schengen, or national, mostly national, and it's also living permits. More than 80% of migrants in Poland who have living permits, they have short-term living permits, which means that the population of migrants who really live in Poland for 5+ years, it's still very little. I mentioned here Pol's card, Karta Polaka, in living permits. Actually, it's not living permit. It's a document which, due to the law, confirms the participation in Polish nationality. But, for example, now, when closing the border, Polish government lets the holders of Karta Polaka, so people without visas and without living permits, to cross the border freely if they wish. And the main part of my topic, how the COVID-19 pandemic affects the Ukrainian migrants community. I will speak less about theory, but more about facts or rather observations, because today we have really low number of statistics which could quote confidently, and really low number of polls made during the last weeks. But we could already observe some trends when talking to professionals who work for NGO, who work for migration law cancellaries, and monitoring social media, because it's one of the main tools of communication about Ukrainian migrants in social groups on Facebook. So the first challenge Ukrainian migrants community met during the last weeks, basically during the last months already, is the challenge. Excuse me? Okay. It's a change of border crossing, because here the situation changed radically. First of all, both Polish and Ukrainian government announced radical changes in border crossings. Hence, Polish government announced it on the 13th of March and implemented it on the 15th. Ukrainian government announced on the same day, but implemented on the 17th of March. Generally, all the foreigners are banned of crossing the border to Poland and to Ukraine. Exclusion is made in Poland for the holders of living permits, of work permits, declarations of employment, which to my mind is only such kind of case in the whole EU, and also Poles card, as I mentioned. In Ukraine, it is limited only to living permit holders. Ban for regular flights and rail routes from 15th of March. Some services were provided lately by both Polish and Ukrainian government. I mean both flights and rail courses from Przemysl to Ukraine, and around 5,000 people used this rail route and flights. Mostly people are still crossing the border, the land border. And here is a large difficulty because we had more than 10 border crossing points between Poland and Ukraine. Now, after April 7th, just 2 of them work. Firstly, it was 3, but the last one, the third one was closed 2 days ago. And if you saw the photos of a large crowd of Ukrainians who tried to cross Polish-Ukrainian border at the end of March, basically these photos were made close to these border crossing points. Since April 7, it is possible to cross this border only by car, which also radically limits people's mobility, because not all of the Ukrainians have their own transport, and for commercial drivers, it's not a reason to take these people home, because they need to pass this 14 days quarantine when crossing the border. As I mentioned, no courses of interregional rail and bus transport in Ukraine, which also, if you even find a car which will help you to cross the Polish-Ukrainian border, it would be really hard to reach your home city in Ukraine. Because it's one story if you are a resident of Western Ukraine, and very different one if you're, for example, a resident of Kharkiv or Zaporizhia. It's practically impossible to reach home if you are crossing the land border. Poland introduced obligatory home isolation for those who cross the border for 14 days. The Ukrainian government a couple of days ago changed the legislation and introduced the obligatory hospital observation for those who cross the border after the April 7th. Even the representatives of Ukrainian embassies are confused how this track will work, but at least law like this is looking today. So, approximately 15% of Ukrainian migrants' population in Poland left the country after the quarantine measures began. I asked about this data Polish border guards, and they informed me about 143,000 Ukrainians who crossed the border after March 15th. Here is like the here is like a short line of the bans and new restrictions which were introduced by different governments. Actually, the last one came just half an hour ago when we started our session. Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki had his press conference, and he introduced that Polish borders will be closed till May 3rd. Also, Ukrainian migrants and migrants in general faced the challenge of applying for new visas and living permits. Maybe the category of migrants who experienced the worst situation are those who left shortly before March 15th to Ukraine to make new Polish visa to come back to country. And their situation is the worst because Polish consulates and visa centers in Ukraine are closed since mid-March. And basically, if they have no visa and no new work permit, there is no way for them to come back. Polish government, when introduced the general antivirus plan, so the plan how to combat the worst results of pandemic for the economy, it also included the regulations on migration to this plan. First version introduced quite a complicated track for those who hold visas and living permit. So you could stay in Poland during the whole epidemic period. But during the next 30 days, you need to apply for a visa permit, and this way to legalize your stay like post factum. 2 days ago, Polish government proposed already a new track, so automatic prolongation of visas, living permits, and also visa-free regimes and Schengen visas. Without a necessary obligation to apply for a residence permit, you could just simply leave the country after the epidemic period will end, but those who want to apply for living permit could do this. Interesting detail, if Ministry of Interior largely comments these new regulations and explains on its webpage how these regulations will work, Ministry of Labor says nothing. So if we, on the one hand, we have a declaration of a government that work permits and declarations of employment will be prolonged automatically, on the other hand, we have no clear manual how Polish employers should use this track. And there is no clear information about the situation of those migrants who will lost their job during this epidemic period. Of course, automatic prolongation of the valid work permits, but due to the Polish legislation, if you lost your job, so you changed your employer, you need to apply for the new set of documents. How it will look during the epidemic period, for me it's a big question. Shortly, changes in the labor market. No official data about unemployment in Poland. In March, Polish authorities quite shy in presenting the economic data in March, but as we see from the Czech Republic, a very familiar situation as in Poland economy and Poland labor market, the unemployment rate jumped like 3 times. So we could expect that in Poland it's more or less the same numbers. Lockdown for most of the services, hotels, tourism, air transport, finances, telecommunications. And actually it affected badly mid and long-term migrants, so these living permits holders. At the same time, the very extensive demand for workers in trade, transport, logistics, constructions, agriculture, which opens the new possibilities for short-term migrants. It's a paradox that during the last years, most of the researchers and NGO activists reported their very unuseful procedures for migrants who are working not directly for an employer, but for so-called agencies. But today, actually, these migrants are in better situation because if they're changing the employer, I mean real employer, but they are employed by an agency, there is no need for them to remain the whole set of the documents. No official information how many migrants lost their job during the last weeks. One of the Polish media made a poll which suggests that 60% of Ukrainian migrants agree that current situation affects them badly, and 1/3 of them lost their job or started to receive lower payments. But there is internet poll, and the sample of this poll was only 100%. So I don't know, could we give a lot of credibility to these numbers, but at least there is the only one we have today. What is important? We had no clear declarations from Polish officials that Poland welcomes migrants, that Poland wishes migrants to stay, that there is no need to leave the country. But the representative of the Ministry of Labor quite often declares that they see the demand for foreign workers, that there is still high, and there is a possibility for foreigners still to find a job in Poland. And just I'm going to the conclusions, changes in social acceptance of migrants and migration, and changes in migrants' plan for the future. When I mean social acceptance, I mean that the topic of migrants are those who so-called steal the work from the home citizens. There are some Polish alt-right parties and political groups which are trying to push this topic since 2014, but as I see during the last days, at least now, it has no big popularity. But on the other hand, I see in a lot of the number of mainstream media the topic that migrants are not an additional element, but a core element of economy, meaning those who work in supermarkets, in transport, in logistics, that there are people whose presence is not a complement, but which is an essential need for the Polish society. And migrants plan for the future, also a paradox. Today it's better situation for physical workers and blue collars, but bad situation for all office workers. The big challenge for them will be, could they cover the rent expenses? So from this point of view, actually April will be a critical month. Because Polish restrictions were announced, I'm finishing. Polish restrictions were announced in the middle of March, but most of the people already paid for their rent. In April, the situation is not so obvious, and actually rent in Poland is the biggest, it's the biggest challenge for most of the migrants who live here permanently. So I'm finishing with the key questions. How many people could live in April? Would it be only these people whose living and working permit are finishing, or some more people who couldn't simply find the jobs? How many workers will move from the big cities to rural area? Because during the last weeks there is a bigger demand for work in rural areas, but not in Warsaw, in Gdańsk, and Wrocław. How many migrants will change their plan to move earlier than expected, or maybe to stay longer than they expected? And also how the latest events will influence the perception of migration both in Poland and in Ukraine. If in Poland I see some positive trends, like people who support us in the hardest times, in Ukraine I see something opposite. In comparison to the situation a year or 2 years ago, when Ukrainian migrants to the EU were accepted as some very positive issue, people who support the home economy, during the last weeks there is a people who brought the virus to our country and who are like a threat to national security. So I'm so sorry for made it so long, but I'm waiting for your questions, commentaries, and many thanks for the attention.
Thank you very much, Olena. Without further ado, I want to pass it now to Stephen. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks, Konrad. Thanks for inviting me to this this forum. Let me see if I can get my screen shared. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay. Let's start that. Great. Okay. Well, I mean, it's hard for me to share because I've got questions and comments on all the previous discussions, but we'll wait for general discussion. Mine will be quite brief because it's just a few thoughts. I communicated with Konrad beforehand, and I thought, I'd just lay out some, some broad thoughts that are just occurring to me as we're going through this this crisis right now. So it's not as well thought out and possibly presented as the previous speakers, but really reacting to the kind of impulse questions that Konrad put forward that are on your screen now. Just broader questions about the impact of pandemia on migration processes and so forth, other sorts of impacts, what it means for the future of migration patterns and processes and so forth. So I'm really just going to drill right down and focus on two, let's say, scenarios that are of particular concern to me. Besides a migration scholar, I'm also a scholar of diverse and complex societies. So one scenario involves questions of diversity, the other one more on migration. So these aren't intended as predictions, but simply as scenarios. There's lots of people writing about which way societies might develop in terms of scenarios, from worst case scenarios to best case, and a range in between. So let's just say that these are some of the more towards the end of worst case scenarios that I'm concerned about. The first one I would put under the category of enduring stigmas that can be attached to different sorts of groups, not least migrants and refugees, undocumented workers. And this is along the line that we recognize that various categories of people already have pre-existing prejudices, patterns of discrimination going against them, and these play out into health inequalities. Kerilyn already mentioned, the disproportionate number of Black Americans suffering and dying from COVID-19. The same is the case in Great Britain as well, where even though Black and ethnic minorities make up 13% of the population. They are suffering at 35% of those infected and dying. So there are groups with pre-existing prejudices, discriminations leading to health inequalities. And I would suggest during this time of the coronavirus, that these become exacerbated and turned into actual stigmas. We know, and again, people have written about how xenophobia is heightened historically during times of pandemics. Yeah, these give rise to all sorts of fears of particular groups, specific groups, as we know, Asian Americans and so forth, but whole categories of groups, migrants, refugees, and so forth. Roma across Eastern Europe right now being confronted with militarized containment and enforced measures. So this is just my one fearful scenario, is that after this time of Corona, call it post-COVID-19, that certain stigmas, health-related stigmas, will stay with particular groups. Health-related stigmas are those that have to do with presumptions of hygiene, of behaviors, of cleanliness, and so forth, and that these will exacerbate forms of discrimination and further patterns of inequality and health outcomes and so forth. So enduring stigma is one possible scenario that I'm concerned about and keeping my eye on. And in the literature, there is a sort of literature about measures that might be taken publicly to destigmatize particular groups. And cases here would be when gay men were particularly labeled with and stigmatized by way of HIV. There was great stigma attached to gay men, but over time, various public measures were taken, and arguably some say that stigma has been largely reduced over the last couple of decades. So there's lessons to be learned from other patterns, previous patterns of both xenophobia and stigma that we might be able to keep an eye on and address in a post-COVID scenario. The other has more to do with the three previous speakers, and maybe this would be some ground for discussion about increasing highly differential restrictions on mobility, particularly international mobility. Now, we know from pre-COVID comparative work that for the past 10 years, there's already been a worldwide trend placing more and more restrictions on low-skilled mobility across borders and reducing restrictions for high-skilled migrants. Restrictions having to do with types of visa being offered, types of jobs people can go into, time periods that people can come for, whether they can bring family or not, whether they can make use of public resources and so forth. And so, as I say, for the last 10 years, worldwide, we've been seeing more restrictions on low-skilled workers, as in many senses, they have been devalued and seen as the less desirable international migrants to have. Now, even while we're going through the COVID period, ironically, in some places anyways, we're seeing a recognition of the need for low-skilled workers. I mean, no less than Donald Trump has called for issuing 35,000 more seasonal worker permits in the US because of the great need for people working in agriculture. I think maybe he did it because I think it includes people who work at golf courses as well. But in any case, we're seeing now that whereas low-skilled workers worldwide have been devalued, that while we're going through this crisis, there's a recognition that we need people. In Germany, where I'm living, the government just in the last week has come out with new measures to try to bring in seasonal agricultural workers, but again, under new kinds of restrictions, but nevertheless allowing a certain type of flow. So that's a kind of ironic positive outcome of going through COVID. Nevertheless, I suggest that a scenario we might be moving into is yes, a recognition of, that countries need low-skill migrant workers to come perform various jobs in various parts of the labor market, but these might become more and more restricted, not just in terms of the type of visa they get, but by way of health-related certification, biometric passports, certificates to show a certain level of health and so forth. We're already starting to see some of these things rolling out. So the last slide is, again, not looking into a crystal ball, but just pointing to one kind of scenario where this might be pointing towards, and that is more and more of what I call a Singapore future for low-skill migrants in many countries. And again, Biao might have a lot to say about this because I know he knows about Singapore. But what I mean by a Singapore future, that even prior to the COVID crisis that we're in now, a place like Singapore absolutely relies on low-skilled workers, seen as a kind of backbone of certain parts of the economy. But the type of restrictions that they have, they're highly regulated visas in terms of the conditions people come under, what kind of work they can do. They cannot switch employers, all these sorts of things. They're highly temporary. People are practically marched to the airport to fly out when their contract ends. They're only for single men and women, men mostly in construction, factory work, women in domestic work. No families allowed. If marriage with Singaporeans is not allowed, if a migrant domestic worker becomes pregnant, even by a Singapore man, she has to fly out of the country again and so forth. Highly restricted conditions. Dwelling for most low-skilled workers is in isolated dormitories outside of the city. And as you see in the lowest picture, they're sort of brought back and forth in caged trucks to construction sites and factories and so forth. Integration is just simply not a word in policy or any kind of a goal for Singaporean low-skilled workers. And I think that trends already moving in this direction for very tightly regulated, controlled, and isolated low-skilled workers might be being rolled out in more and more countries, maybe not quite as extreme as Singapore, but in this direction. And again, post-COVID, possibly with greater health monitoring of these populations to address public fears of migrants from different parts of the world. And again, as we're seeing in the middle slide there, that by keeping them in isolated dwellings, they can quickly be quarantined in the breakout of any sort of health issue like a pandemic as well. And already, numerous lawyers and others have looked at the Singapore situation and talked about all sorts of problems with human rights, with workers' rights, with family rights, and so forth. And again, this is a possible future for many countries. And I've already talked with some of my staff about this, and some of the staff from the Middle East are saying, well, yeah, it's Singapore future, but you could also talk about a Dubai future or an Emirates future, because they're already working under this sort of model as well. So this is a different kind of mobility issue. I'm going to have to think through this in terms of Kerilyn's and Biao's models, but maybe this is the sort of thing we can talk about also in our discussion. What kind of future scenarios arise out of these things? Already, I think Olena's material from addressing Ukrainians in Poland already point to some dynamics going on by way of, I was already reading her material by way of Kerilyn's and Biao's models as well. So yeah, hopefully we can have discussions of possible future scenarios as well as these sorts of models as to what's happening in the lead up to COVID-19 crisis. Okay, I'll leave you with a quick advertisement and then turn off my mic and look for discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I will encourage all to now formulate their questions in the chat, or say who wants to ask question personally. And before there is already one question there, I'll start asking you these questions, but just wait a few more minutes so as they appear, or information who wants to ask them personally appears in the chat. And just before that, I'd like to take opportunity to ask a quick question to last speakers. I believe there will be plenty of questions to Kerilyn and Biao. I'll leave my questions to them for later. But very quick questions just to start off to Stephen and Olena. I wonder, I really sympathize with your views on this stigmatization processes, and as you rightly pointed out, and Kerilyn mentioned that in the situation in how in this totally new world that we are living in now, how certain stigmas are in a way multiplied, and to some extent how certain groups, racialized groups, are for example more visible among those who victims of the pandemic. But just quick questions to you, Stephen, about the restrictions. Do you think, don't you think that the restrictions will hugely depend on the conditions of the economy, namely in particular the unemployment rates, and how this will be, what sort of unemployment rates we'll see in the upcoming months? We're seeing some data from US. The Polish government is not, hasn't, at least I haven't seen any data on the unemployment rate in Poland. We believe that obviously it is as bad as in those countries that have published some data on unemployment, for example, US. Don't you think, Stephen, that this will be strictly related to this, the economic condition, the restrictions that you've talked about?
Yeah, I think clearly it will. And again, I'm just thinking through Carolyn's idea of structural constraints to mobilities and so forth. Yeah, of course, that as post-COVID, whenever that's going to come, you know, different sectors of the economy will certainly have their own speed and pace. And in places where you have so many people thrown into unemployment and precarious positions and so forth, yeah, it remains this question: what jobs that migrants were filling will be taken by locals, let's call them. What will remain wholly in the hands of migrant workers? I mean, already in Trump's, you know, surprising call for more seasonal worker permits, you know, the backlash already from his own party was, well, how can you give these out when 10 million Americans are just out of work? Why don't you have them all go pick crops and work in landscaping and so forth? So, yeah, I think, you know, these are large issues about what parts of the economy get filled, but also I'm just thinking in terms of the stigma issue about how everyday xenophobias and stigmas that are arising through this crisis, and people associating risk, health risk, and hygiene questions and so forth, placing them on particular groups, how politicians and policymakers both address the economy and, as ever, have to address the wider public and their voting public and so forth, you know, in a time of heightened xenophobia as well. So I don't have a direct answer for that, except to say, yes, of course, this needs to be played out in terms of how the economy moves back differentially in different sort of sectors, at the same time as public opinion is doing different sorts of things as we come out of this. Now, while I have the floor, can I ask a question first?
Yeah, go ahead, of course, yeah.
I mean, particularly one thing that that Olena put up made me think of a question to ask of Kerilyn and Biao. I mean, Olena, you had that nice kind of timeline about things happening in Poland and how that's affecting Ukrainian migration or being stranded and so forth. And that just made me think about asking Kerilyn and Biao both about the temporal dimension of the sort of issues that you're talking about, i.e., Kerilyn, capabilities and aspirations. Let's keep it focused on the COVID period. Those are changing the more we're moving into this period, and as we start to move out, again, like I was saying to Konrad, as the economy changes and so forth. So all of these capabilities and aspirations and structural constraints themselves are shifting. And so have you thought of a temporal dimension to your sort of lines of argument? And likewise, Biao, I mean, it's fantastic. I love these 6 types. But of course, I was thinking, well, the same individual through time can go through several of these mobilities, depending on, again, these structural constraints, capabilities, aspirations, location, simply where they are, as you pointed out as well. So again, have you thought about the temporalities of these 6 different types?
Biao, Kerilyn, would you like to answer?
Who should I go first? Yeah, but I don't see the image. Yeah, probably I just, yeah, I haven't really formulated my thought yet, but I think the question of time is obviously extremely important. Then the question is that how should we devise a framework that can bring in the factor of time to our analysis in a illuminating way, because otherwise, you know, I mean, everything is related to time. So we have to be quite analytically selective in thinking how we use the factor of time. One thing just come to my mind is I have another project now thinking, I mean, it's developing called the Mobile Livelihoods, which is really about the time. You know, in India, so many people, migrant workers, have to flee is primarily because of time. Why is that? Because they are day wager. So they get paid on daily basis. And then they buy food on daily basis. They have no capacity of stockpiling for 2 days of food. So therefore, there is no physical possibility for them to quarantine themselves. So then actually the immobility itself implies a certain requirement of temporal rearrangement of your life. Right? You stay home, so therefore you must use some cash in advance to get food for the coming 2 weeks. Right? You organize life in that way. But many people are not able, are not just simply not capable to play with time in this way. So that is one aspect how time is important. Then as Steve alluded to, it's an extremely important point, you know, the 6 patterns of mobility certainly are not fixed 6 patterns. One will lead to another, and also one individual may engage with different type of mobilities, sometimes simultaneously. So the question is, yes, I mean, the response is yes, absolutely, time is very important, but then the challenge is how should we bring time in? I haven't really developed a very clear framework yet in this aspect. Yeah. So except I would say, yeah. Now I'm thinking in every pattern of mobility, time is extremely important. The reaction mobility is by definition very sharp, right? It has a huge peak, then will go down. Then it's like how European state was talking about, you know, flattening the curve and etc. How can you flatten it? How you regulate that type of mobility through a temporal lens? Then substitution mobility. then time is extremely important too. You have to deliver food and critical equipment in a timely manner. So there's a lot of logistical consideration come into play. Yeah, extremely important, but I'm sorry, I cannot give a clear answer at this stage.
Kerilyn, would you like to answer?
Sure, thanks. That's a great question. Yeah, I would say in terms of this aspiration capability model and the different mobility and immobility categories, it suggests that these are, as you said, more ideal types rather than fixed empirical categories. So these kind of can help us see different realities, which then when you apply it to a particular context, you have to get into the nitty-gritty of. And one aspect of the nitty-gritty is time. Things change, people's resources change over time, their aspirations shift, their capabilities shift. And I think this is really an area that I'd like to explore more, which is the interaction of aspiration and capability over time. So imagine an individual who is, we might say, involuntarily immobile. They really desire to migrate, but they can't. Are they going to live the rest of their life in that experience? Will they adjust their aspirations in light of the constraints that they're facing? Just because it's hard to live with that existential reality. So I think that's true at the level of individuals, but I would say that there has been some theorization of the dynamics of aspirational and capability shifts at a more collective level in some of the work I've been doing with Hein de Haas when theorizing the relationship between migration and development. So earlier in my remarks, I mentioned that we could think about Ethiopia as a country where there are rising aspirations to migrate, but opportunities to migrate haven't increased at the same pace. So this is a country where there's been this big demographic boom, rising levels of education, the expansion of market forces, all of these things that have contributed to shifting expectations among young people for the kinds of lives that they want to live and have led to increasing urbanization, but also rising levels of international migration for those who can migrate. And for those who can't, there's this growing feeling and experience of being involuntarily immobile. But over time, for those who are familiar with the relationship between migration and development, we actually often see this inverted U-shaped curve in the sense that as countries experience at least economic development, we see rising levels of international migration. And at a certain level around middle income status, countries tend to sort of plateau, and then levels of immigration taper off, out-migration taper off, as immigration levels tend to increase. And so to explain this trend, I think aspirations can actually play a role in that. In the beginning levels of development, when you see international migration rates increasing, these are times when the aspirations of young people exceed the local opportunities that they have. But once sort of the development, the structural development of countries catches up, as local opportunities do increase, the need to migrate to realize one's aspirations decreases, that there are more opportunities at home. And so this can help explain why we see this curve in this relationship between migration and development. I'm not sure if that's totally clear for those who are not already familiar with the debate, but just to say that even at the collective level, I think there's some, there's some benefit to bringing aspirations into the picture and not only looking at the structural determinants of mobility and immobility.
Thank you very much, Kerilyn. I'd like to ask some of the questions from the forum. So Ruswan is asking about migrants, labor migrants moving from one industry to another, whether this is already happening. This is interesting what we can see at the moment in this lockdown moment, that it's actually not all sectors of the economy that are actually suffering. There are some sectors of the economy that are booming. For example, a small advertisement of Poland's city project that has produced this very important game, that the gaming generally sector is booming. Another sector is booming. So there are articles talking about Amazonification of the economy. So obviously Amazon and other companies are booming. So in those places, probably migrants are easily finding jobs. Important questions to Olena from Karol Kaczorowski. In your perception, well, what is the perception in social media of Ukrainian return migrants in Ukraine? In Poland, as you probably observed, the perception of Poles returning during the time of COVID is quite negative. This is what I mentioned at the very beginning, as migrants have turned from this, in a way, the sort of an image of gods to image of those we are fearing, and this huge stigma suddenly emerged and became attached. Is it also a case in Ukraine, Olena?
Yeah, thanks, Konrad. I found a couple of questions in chat which strictly or some way refer to my person.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe firstly about flow of migrants labor force from one industry
Mm-hmm.
to another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
during the last weeks, I had a possibility to speak with the representatives of two big Polish work agencies. I mean the companies which cooperate with big Polish business and recruit for them workers in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Moldova, mostly, sometimes in Georgia and in Russia. I'm talking about the agencies which are recruiting like thousands of people a year, not like tens or hundreds. To their mind, up to the beginning of April, 1/5 of the migrants they hire, they lost their job, mostly in production. But all of these people who wished to stay in Poland, who declared that they want to stay, they want to change the job, they already find another one. Mostly in advertisement and logistics. On the one hand, it's a good option because being employed by an agency, they formally didn't change the employer. So all their set of documents, I mean, living permit, visa, or work permits are still valid. But on the other hand, it is not all the work of the same quality. When you are working for Volkswagen on production and when you are working like a cashier or a person in logistics. First of all, it's lower income. Second, it's another kind of stability. So we already see the flow of foreign migrants labor force from production to retail, to logistics, to transport. As I said, my contacts estimate this flow like 20%, but how it looks in the market where not an agency is an employer, so not a big business, but like some places where tens of migrants, like 50 of migrants are employed, I'm not ready to answer this question yet, we will see. Second, about the perception of Ukrainian migrants in Ukraine. To my mind, during the last 2 or 3 weeks, we observed a real disaster in these terms. The perception of Ukrainian labor migrants in the EU, especially those who came back home from northern Italy and from northern Spain, it's really a wave of hate speech, which I observe not only in social media, which is like a typical place for such kind of rhetoric, but also in mainstream print and television. That you could hear and you could observe that communicate that these people are coming, these people who didn't live in our home country during the last years, but were delighted by all the bonuses of European Union civilization. Now in the bad times, they are coming to our beautiful motherland to spread the viruses around them. Of course, there were a couple of stories which I think are true about some mostly women who really came from northern Italy even at the beginning of March, and instead of coming for self-isolation for at least a week, I don't say even about 2 weeks, they started to visit their relatives, friends, and it provoked like a local increasement of COVID-19 issues in this area. But at the very same time, you had a case with Ukrainian MPs who came back home from France, from Courchevel, from a very expensive ski base, who visited journalists, parliament sessions, who gave the interviews, press conferences, attended a lot of expert meetings. And for them, they were like rather a point of ironical observations that, haha, we didn't expect much from these people, but there is no hate on them. But in case of migrants, it's a way of hate, and it's very sad for me that Ukrainian authorities did nothing to oppose this. It seems to me it was yesterday or 2 days ago, Ukrainian ambassador to Poland, Andriy Deshitsa, he declared officially that he doesn't suggest Ukrainian migrants to come home in the next weeks. He explained this with the new border restrictions, which is really true, as I said. But to my mind, when the ambassador of your country officially said that you are not welcome during the next weeks, for me, it's not a kind of taking responsibility. It's rather a kind of resign from responsibility. But as I said, it's very subjective. And I think that the last one question referred to me, it's Marta Skindler about social network and how forced isolation affected Ukrainian migrants in terms of using the capacity of these networks. Marta, to my regret, I think that there is too early to some statements on this issue. We could rather use the hypothesis. To my mind, if we are talking about the migrants who are employed in the spheres which are still ongoing, which are not locked down, I mean supermarkets, logistics, transport, agriculture. Of course, their social networks were affected, but not so much. There are still people who are going from home to work every day, and a lot of people from their social networks, it's basically their colleagues from the same firm or same company. In terms of migrants who are blue and white collars, who are staying home or their employer led them to stay at home, or they were simply fired. For them, I think, yeah, really, that the latest event, they made a big damage to their social networks. But I think we need to wait for the face-to-face interview. It's really hard to tackle such things in Facebook.
Thank you very much, Olena, for tackling the questions that I asked you, and also those that you have that they were there in the chat to answer. Now I'd like
but if you have some questions for me, you wish me to refer, just one short remark about immunity pass somebody mentioned in the chat. I want to remind that a couple of years ago, it was a Czech embassy and Czech consulate in Ukraine which wished Ukrainians who applied for both Czech national visa and Schengen to present the certificate they do not have AIDS infection. And it was not like during 1 month or 2, it was practice which was realized almost during a year. And Czech embassy and Czech consulate stopped this practice only after the strong pressure from other EU members. But we already had such precedents, and not like in Southeast Asia or in Southern Asia, but really close to the European Union borders.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the chance to ask a question personally by Sinhuja, then Agnieszka, and then Harald. So Sinhuja, now you can ask the question, please.
Okay, hi, my name is Sinhuja. So I'm a social psychologist and I work in Poland. So thank you very much for this seminar. I apologize for missing the first talk. So I guess this question could be related to what Biao was saying in terms of how timing is extremely important in implementing measures. And I'm particularly interested in how one can implement preventive measures concerning COVID in a country like India. I think it's very difficult to implement models of Taiwan or Singapore in a country like India because, for one, you have a very large socioeconomic gap. Secondly, you also have a lot of people who are, I wouldn't say illiterate, but yeah, but also who absolutely lack awareness about the seriousness of the situation. Which is why I would like to know, in your opinion, I mean, I believe that this sudden lockdown that was imposed by the Indian government was completely unplanned, unprepared, and in terms of timing was extremely wrong. As you can see, millions of migrants are walking for 200 kilometers to reach their homes. So in that regard, the timing has been extremely bad. But at the same time, it's clear that people are also not aware of the concept of social distancing and how quickly it can spread, because when the government was asking people to clap hands and light candles instead of actual measures, people were doing that on the streets and having processions. So, so the question is basically what kind of, in your opinion, what might be a better structure or better implementation strategy for a country like India?
And this is a question to whom?
I don't know if I pronounced his name right. Biao?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Of course, this is a not only $1 million question, it's probably a million life question. I'm afraid I cannot answer because I know nothing about the public health. This is another challenge in this time when we study issues like this. We really need lots of specialist knowledge in order to say anything meaningfully. But if we go back to the question of time, as Steve reminds us to pay special attention to, so there's a different dimension of time, right? One thing you mentioned is about timing. Timing is that which specific spot, which moment that you should announce a particular policy, the timing. Then you have the this first probably meaning of time, the timing, time as timing. Second is a time as a duration, time as a kind of relatively linear dimension through which events unfolds. So therefore you have today, you have tomorrow, so the situation will change, people's perception also change. So that's, therefore it's dynamic. So the third meaning of time, I'm thinking, is time is a distributive. Time is not a linear empty dimension that along which things happen, but time is distributive, meaning certain things, the certain mobility actually does not matter in most of the time. But if that mobilities happen at the same time, at one moment, then it will become extremely consequential, right? I mean, if migrants go home, I mean, this is what they do regularly. But if all the migrants want to go home, you know, catch the last bus in the bus stops in Delhi or Tamil Nadu, I mean, as we, in Madras, as we see, then it is, then the nature of that behavior changed completely. So, I mean, in policy making process, I suppose we have to consider all these different dimensions. And what the Indian government have done, I think is, I mean, this is really, I can't comment. We don't know on what basis, you know, Modi government would make such a dramatic decision. And as if they don't know, there are many migrants in the cities who are paid on daily basis. I don't know, do they know? We would assume they knew that it should not be a surprise, but somehow it appears to be surprise to even Modi himself. So he had to come out and to apologize to citizens, etc. So I'm afraid I cannot comment, but on this regard, I just want to say something. Konrad mentioned earlier, Wuhan, you know, it's a very symbolic city now because the first epicenter in the world has lifted its lockdown. And now the Chinese government said something, I think it's quite revealing. They said that now we have to establish a bottom line thinking. My interpretation is the bottom line thinking is that we will have to get prepared to sacrifice certain things. Basically, what the Chinese government said now is, okay, now the lockdown is lifted, but the battle is far from finished. Because other countries, you know, the virus is going around, and within China, you may have a second or third wave, as we have witnessed in Singapore already. So what the reason I mention this is that the Indian was probably thinking of like China model, try to lock down quickly and want to suppress the virus, and so therefore, declare a end of this battle, right? It wanted to be a very quick war, a soon war. And then they're not thinking time as distributive or time as kind of a process. But actually, the life of virus probably is more complex. Once you suppress it quickly, it may come back. And also we're living in a globalized world. China can isolate itself through extreme measures for a while, but how long can you do that? How long can you live in that kind of condition? And this is why the Chinese government now came out to say, we have to establish a bottom line thinking. My interpretation is that, maybe the virus will come back and probably we will not be able to lock down again. So then some people will have to die. We have to be prepared to make a certain sacrifice. So then in this thinking, then time become more important. I think that was what the British government was thinking originally, so therefore they were thinking of flattening the curve, even propose the idea of developing herd immunity through time. So because they said, otherwise you don't have exit strategy. If you want to suppress too quickly, and then you are frozen to that condition, you cannot lift. Because once you leave, the virus comes back. So anyway, sorry again, the question is, so the question of time is really a question of wisdom. How we cannot be too impatient, wanted to see a victory quickly. Maybe it will last for quite a while until we have the vaccine, until we have a medical science breakthrough. Yeah. So.
Thank you very much, Biao. Now I'd like to ask to give possibility to Agnieszka Radziwinowiczówna to. Sorry, Agnieszka.
No worries.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Konrad. Thank you very much for organizing this, and thank you very much for all the presenters for your very interesting interventions, really inspiring. So my question is to Stephen. Nonetheless, it also relates to what Olena has already answered in her answers. So basically, it refers particularly to the new stigmas that health stigmas that Stephen has commented about, and just like my commentary is that now we are living in very liminal times, as you also some of your presenters said, and in the theories of liminality in social anthropology, for instance, Victor Turner says that during the liminal times, the social structure, the typical social structures are withheld, and the normal inequalities that we are used to in the society are withheld as well. So relating to health inequalities mentioned by Stephen, how do you think they build upon, if they build upon at all, to what we are normally used to when it comes to this health stigma? So just two examples of people who are normally seen as the privileged members of our societies that are now being stigmatized. For instance, people who flee their COVID-19 related affected cities when they try to flee those places in their camper vans and go to rural areas when they wish to be safe from the epidemic, or people who come back to their countries of citizenship being previously immobile on cruises that were affected by the disease. So Olena also said about migrants who go back to Ukraine, previously seen as gods, now being stigmatized as a threat. So how do you think these new health-related stigmas build upon the inequalities that we have been used to? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. No, interesting question. Yeah, and first with the issue of liminal times, liminality, of course, another key of that sort of Victor Turner idea is also a communitas, a greater sense of solidarity, which we're also seeing, which is part of this normal structures being removed, and we are seeing in many places greater solidarity. So at least that's a good news. But yeah, with the idea of the privileged, maybe I would be using stigma in a different way there. Certainly, yeah, the virus and the reactions to it play out differently. And, you know, just some of the kinds of mobilities like Biao mentioned, you know, the reaction mobilization, well, people fleeing to their second homes in the countryside, that is a very privileged way of having a reaction mobilization, kind of as you're suggesting as well. But what I was talking about in terms of the enduring stigma are groups that had, let's say, a pre-COVID health inequalities and patterns of prejudice and discrimination anyways, and those getting magnified and enhanced through the COVID period, such that this extra stigma is the thing that lingers. I don't worry about the people with the second homes or the people who are able to retreat into home offices getting the disease, and let's wish them well, but they'll come out the other side of it, you know, without a particularly lasting stigma, although there might be something to that. But those people, you know, Black Americans, Chinese, migrants of different kinds who have gone through the disease and come out the other end, and there's something I think that's going to stick to them, and that's what I'm calling stigma. And it's going to perpetuate in other forms of health inequalities, and as I'm suggesting, possibly also in further patterns of restrictions on their mobility. Now, just while I'm on that, there was that other question that Olena already addressed a little bit about immunity passports and whether that's going to help something like some of the stigmas or other sort of post-crisis scenario. And I'm in two minds about those. I think the immunity passports, for those who don't know these, this is some countries, I think UK, I know in Germany they're talking about these, of giving certain antibody testing that will show whether a person, knowingly or not, has had COVID-19 and have built up the antibodies to be immune to it, and then giving them some sort of certificate that allows them to go back to work. And in that way, it's just an idea to try to get certain parts of the economy going again. Just what I was saying to Konrad, certain parts are going to get going while others are still in lockdown. And of course, that's a good idea on one hand from policymakers to try to get some people back to normalcy, try to get the economy going so we're not so utterly crushed. My only fear is here, and I'm sorry if I'm going to be sounding to everybody like a real pessimist. Usually I'm quite optimistic, that this might bring about new kinds of stratification, i.e. who's allowed to go to work and who's not. And it's often the privileged who might have access to the testing or other sorts of quick access to be able to get this passport, whereas less privileged people who live in certain types of areas or neighborhoods or are working, you know, illicitly, aren't going to be able to get that immunity passport. And so stratification, senses of relative deprivation, it could bring about a new tension. And beyond that, of course, if there's something like immunity passports that allow people to get back to work, or indeed to be able to move across borders, you're going to have an instant market for forged documents as well. We know, we can predict that. I mean, they'll be ready tomorrow on a black market. And so it's going to really, that itself might cause a kind of public health issue as well, having forged immunity passports that allow people into certain quarters. So anyways, I hope somebody asks a question that allows me to be more optimistic before we end this all. But thanks for the question. Yeah.
Harald, is your question more optimistic? Your turn to ask your question. You have to unmute your mic.
Yeah.
Yes, now try again.
Yeah,
now.
That should work.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, I hope it's a bit more optimistic. I have a question for Biao Xiang. Thanks a lot for your presentation. I was asking myself whether the mobility of information could play a role here or is relevant somehow. Because what we are doing now is we are making information mobile in a way that is not totally new, but it's happening on an unprecedented scale. Everybody of us is in dozens of Skype conferences and Zoom conferences every week. And I guess this is very unequally distributed. We are doing that also. Kerilyn was referring to that, a thing that other people cannot do. So there is a very unequally distributed capability of immobility or physical immobility that we do here. However, also in poorer income groups, at least we know this from Bangladesh, from field work, from Thailand, from other countries, there information becomes mobile more and more. And people are coordinating themselves. They are self-organizing. At the same time, we have at the moment a re-centralization of information hegemony. Governments are trying to get hold of information, disinformation, misinformation. So information plays a very key role here. Also, and this popped up in one of the other questions, how do migrants get informed about all these things themselves? So is the mobility of information something that could play a role here?
And this is a question to whom?
To Biao.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, this is a great question. I think it's extremely important, the distribution and the mobility of information. We do see very clearly there's a trend of centralization of information and the data. And part of it, of course, is for the control virus itself. I mean, nowhere else in the world is more obvious than in China, right? You have the mobile phone is used as a device, then they can check every person's temperature of that morning. So I don't know whether you know about this, called the health code. Yeah. So every morning when you go out from your condo, the guard will have to check your health code. The health code is tied to your the WeChat Pay and another online. Now I can't remember. Is Alibaba company is related to your everyday payment system, and then you have put in your temperature, and also the mobile phone automatically detect where you have been over the last 14 days, whether or not you have interacted with anyone who were infected by the virus. If you have been interacted with any patients, your code, health code, will be yellow color. So it means you are not supposed to go out. So otherwise you'll be green, and then only the person who are green color can go out. I mean, this information is very centralized. And we know that the information itself is supposed to be a river. It's supposed to be transmitted horizontally among all citizens. So therefore, migration traditionally is an extremely important channel through which informations are move around. So therefore, certain opinions are being formulated. And this is why universities are always related to mobility, because universities come together. So therefore, you debate, then you generate new thought about the world. So therefore, the mobility of physical body and the new understanding of the world are directly related. But now it's not encouraged at all, because you are not supposed to move around. So then the information, I mean, though we have this mobile phone and the social media, you can interact horizontally, but all this information, the real data, is coming from one single source. Basically now is the government about how many people died and what's going on in different parts of the world. Everything is mediated through this one center in terms of information. Then similarly, in terms of transaction, Konrad talked about the Amazonization or Amazonification of economy. What does this mean? This basically means the centralization of transactions. If you go to high street, you know, all the shops there, and you buy as an individual person to buy from this shop or from another shop, this shop will have its own suppliers in this county, and that shop have another supplier from different parts of the country. So that is a kind of networked commerce. I mean, this is a normal situation. But what is Amazonification? It's basically one platform monopolize the transactions, right? All the goods have to go through their distribution center and go through their warehouses, go through their data system. So therefore you have a centralization of both the information circulation as well as goods transactions. So I think the movement of, but I just feel the term of movement of information, yeah, it's a little it's very difficult to give it a concrete shape if we do empirical research. You know, it is good image to think with, but I just feel that it's still we don't have the tool to really capture it. But the circulation of goods, the movement of things, as I mentioned, is I think a ready topic for empirical study, which is extremely important. Yeah. Thank you for your question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
Konrad, your microphone is switched off.
Yeah.
I already read Justina's question, so if you wish, I could
go
answer.
ahead, please. Yeah.
Yeah, Justina in chat asked a question about the information policy of Polish authorities towards migrants in the time of epidemic and to compare the situation with other countries. Today, I spoke to my colleague from Germany, the country which is richer than Poland and generally has more developed migration policies in Poland. And also she confirmed that in this hard time, all the governments have the problem how to reach migrants population with the information issued in terms of restrictions on border crossing, new restrictions of behavior in public area and so on. In Poland today, it looks like that due to some polls, only 1/3 to 1/4 of migrants living in Poland receives information about the country from Polish media. So it means that all these communiques which are issued for Polish television or Polish newspapers, they are 2/3 of migrants are already missing them. It's like the first point. Second point, I just checked it 1 minute ago that, for example, the governmental portal about coronavirus, which is leading by Health Ministry, you could find here informations about in Russian and in Ukrainian, but there are only this information that they're referring to border crossing and to new restrictions issued from April 1st. It's all information you can find in Russian and in Ukrainian. To my mind, if we're talking about the successes of Polish government, they communicate that Poland will help all the foreigners, despite they have medical insurance or no, to have tests and to receive the treatment if they are infected by coronavirus. This communicate was issued even before the border closure. And it was really well disseminated. I didn't met a person in internet, a person during the last months, which didn't know that if he or she is a foreigner and has no medical insurance, that he could go to the Polish hospital and ask for a test and ask for a treatment. It's a success of Polish government. The failure of Polish government, it's very poor communication and poor finances of NGOs. Because in this hard time, it's obviously that when there are new restrictions, new regulations, even they are translated in Ukrainian and Russian, especially if we're talking about regulations which are dealing with the legalization of work and of legal stay in Poland. If you just read this information in Russian or in Ukrainian, it gives you nothing. You really need the lawyer's commentary about how these particular norms will work in the nearest future, how they will be implemented. It's really hard for the people who are in the topic during the last years, but I think it's really impossible for people who are simply working in Poland. So the best scenario if non-governmental organizations took a stick and helped the government to disseminate this information, to explain the situation, the restrictions, the new possibilities for migrants. But during the last years, firstly, Polish government froze funding for the third sector. Next, it creates a new scheme Now there are family fountains, but only 3 grants for each voivodeship. So the same amount of money, for example, for Warsaw and for Kielce. And it's not enough, not sufficient to cover all the informational needs. I know some NGOs which are crowdfunding to help to push the info lines to help the migrants to receive some objective information. But how much needs could you cover with just 2 people in your team whose salary is covered by crowdfunding? So really, I quite agree with you that it's a big failure, and information policy remain not an asset of Polish authorities. But as I said, in the other European Union countries, the situation is quite the same. All the national governments now are in the process of how to find better channels. For example, German government engages local journalists, both freelance and both who work for some foreign media, to spread the information on their Facebook, on their Twitter, to publish these communiques. Does something like that happen in Poland? I have no news about it.
Thank you very much, Olena. We've just passed 4 p.m. in Poland, in Warsaw. I believe it's 9 a.m. in Georgia, in US. It's good time to close this seminar. Thank you very much for this fantastic discussion, for being with us, especially the speakers, but also everybody else. Is over 50 persons still there. So once again, it was for us also first experience, but I believe it went pretty smoothly. So thanks a lot. We've recorded this seminar and we'll try to share it also through our YouTube channel, and we'll inform you about the next seminars. Thanks a lot. Once again, have a good afternoon, evening, morning, day, and see you soon. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And remember, Zoom could be used not only for work, but also for drinking. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Stay safe.
Thank you. And big thanks to my friend Jan Brzozowski, who was the invisible man making this possible. So big thanks to Jan for moderating it technically. Thanks a lot, Jan. Take care. Bye.